Hey people, it's me here. Can you hear this microphone? How's it going, my fellow human beings? It's your boy Closet Pumpkin, back with another video game review. Now, it's been a hot minute since I reviewed the last thing, so I figured why not return with a banger and talk instead about the most traumatic event to happen in United States history, 9/11. Since it's, 9/11, it's worth using some reverence and tact with this very formative event in American history. It's also been over 20 years since, which both means that we can look back at the event with the benefit of hindsight, as well as post real sick memes about it in the History Meme subreddit. In case you need a recap, on September 11th, 2001, several commercial airliners were hijacked and flown into two high-profile buildings in New York City, and one into the Pentagon, the U.S. geometric shape dedicated to defense. Another was headed towards the White House, but landed in a field in Pennsylvania due to the passengers reverse hijacking the hijackers. This all didn't happen at once. Rather, the news of the attacks rolled in over the period of a few hours. When the first plane hit, there was a massive wave of confusion, which turned to stark horror when the second plane hit, proving that it was an intentional attack.
See it there.
Where? I didn't see it. Oh, whoa.
Oh my God.
We're under attack.
Going into buildings.
More news rolled in of attacks, and nobody knew when it was going to stop. The country was stunned, collectively staring at their TV screens, sharing in one another's trauma. The mass pain and anguish quickly turned itself towards its alleged perpetrators, as during the attacks and in the days that followed, we identified the attackers as belonging to a radical terrorist cell called Al-Qaeda. After this indescribably heinous act that sentenced thousands to death and countless more to deal with the fallout, America for a time became reactively phobic of anything Arabic, with our culture conjuring the image of a cave-dwelling, turban-wearing, goat-towel head as the archetype of our disdain for terrorists, TM. What's more is the accusations, or specifically reports, that Middle Eastern nationalities, such as Iraq, had nuclear arms painted a picture of a part of the world that hated us, hated our way of life, and hated you.
Tomorrow morning, for the first time in 4 years, UN weapons inspectors will be back in Iraq to scour a country the size of California for evidence of weapons of mass destruction. What they find or don't find may well determine if the United States goes to war against Iraq. Leading the team is Hans Blix, an unflappable Swedish diplomat regarded as brilliant but cautious. Are you going to be tough?
We're being correct and effective.
Correct and effective. There are people that say what this job needs is somebody tough and aggressive.
Aggressive is an American quality. You're aggressive in business, that's fine. Aggression is prohibited under the UN Charter. And as a European, I rather use the word dynamic and effective, if you don't mind.
All we needed was evidence that, unfortunately, wasn't quite there. When Hans Binks's team returned, having conclusively found nothing nuclear in the country, President Bush insisted that the country still had chemical weapons, bioweapons, and nuclear weapons, citing an internal CIA report. In 2004, a request under the Freedom of Information Act was put in, and the CIA report was released to the public, with 85% of it being censored with whiteout. In 2005, a second request was put in, and this time, we got to see the whole thing. The report,
links in the description,
definitively states that there was evidence of chemical weapons, but absolutely no evidence of bioweapons and nuclear weapons. In fact, Saddam Hussein, at the time honcho to the poncho of Iraq, had followed along with the UN's orders in disarming the nation. The report also cited anonymous second-hand sources and CIA black site detainees under torture who said that Iraq was training Al-Qaeda personnel and deploying weapons of mass destruction. While these could be called the less substantial parts of the report, back in 2002, when it was still totally classified, these points were treated a little differently.
We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more. Given Saddam Hussein's history of aggression, given what we know of his grandiose plans, given what we know of his terrorist associations, and given his determination to exact revenge on those who oppose him, should we take the risk that he will not someday use these weapons at a time, in a place, and in a manner of his choosing, at a time when the world is in a much weaker position to respond?
Later, many of the assertions in Colton's speech would prove inaccurate But at the time, his words reflected the considered judgment of intelligence agencies at home and around the world. Do you wish you'd been less exhaustive, eloquent, and persuasive?
No, that was my job at the time, and the information that I was being given by the intelligence community hung together. And I spent 4 days and nights out at the CIA going over it and asking every way I could, are you sure of this? You have multiple sources on this. And I got those assurances. There's the same assurances that the intelligence community gave to the president, the same assurances the intelligence community gave to the Congress 4 months earlier.
When this document came to light, it was ridiculed as being one of the worst modern NIEs by David Kay, who wrote fucking NIEs for a living. He cited the intense pressure to reach a premature conclusion as the reasoning behind it. A government-funded think tank drafted a report of this report called Blinders, Blunders, and Wars, making the case that the Iraq War was a real bad fucky-wucky that we can all learn from. Right now, however, we're jumping ahead in the timeline.
Back when 9/11 was fresh in our minds,
some Americans viewed Iraqi citizens as hateful barbarians. Some Americans saw them as subjugated people under evil rule. Either way, all they really needed was some freedom dumped on their asses. And, as luck would have it, we were just the righteous, loving children of God to do it. And so, for 20 years, we did. Within a couple of years of us waging this technically not a war in Iraq, it became very clear that the reports of nuclear weapons in the region were completely falsified. In fact, American and British intelligence knew at the time that the reports were false and warned that invading the region would seriously destabilize it. But that didn't slow down yet-to-be kitty cat portrait painter George W. Bush and Tony Blair, who were mobilizing to invade Iraq despite its clear uninvolvement. Which means that, assuming the official story is completely true, which of course it is, we're not fucking conspiratards here, that 9/11 was undeniably used as an excuse to invade the region for our own country's political interests. Such as...
Oi you! Shut your mouth and look at my wad! Loads of money!
For 20 fucking years after 9/11, weapons contractors made hundreds of billions of dollars with zesty military and private security contracts, like Lockheed Martin, for instance, who made $45 billion alone in 2017, or Halliburton, a fracking and oil company who Vice President Dick Cheney was a chairman of at the time. As we destabilized the region by dumping hot freedom all over Iraqi country, oil fields fell under Western control and were divvied up to American companies to work. Prior to the invasion of Iraq, Western oil companies hadn't been active in the country since 1973. During the invasion, however, that quickly changed, with major companies like BP and ExxonMobil planting their roots in the country. Even after the US pulled out, Western oil firms remained. The sheer level of racketeering that took place is too staggering to expand upon in detail, but a lot of rich people made a lot of money in the hate-driven war following the scar on the American psyche. And, while the Iraqi people were dehumanized and reduced to hissing, towel-headed ooga-booga strawmen, the reality was that millions of innocent people were wiped out by a military force vastly superior to them in size, force, and armaments, originating from a culture that, coincidentally, loves an underdog. The propaganda official narrative, and the one that many patriotic Americans swallowed whole, was that we were there to righteously spread democracy in a barbaric and backwards region. However, 20 years after the fact, we lost our last foothold in Afghanistan in 2 weeks with an embarrassing retreat that left our allies with their pants down and leaving the entire Middle East much, much worse than it was before, without too much freedom or democracy to show for it. Not only that, and very understandably, the unwelcome Western presence and war crime stuff in the region stirred up a lot of anti-Western sentiment and served to create a much more radical and in touch with the youth variant of the terrorist cell we fought to begin with. Some of you out there may label one or two of these actions quote-unquote criminal. However, I would call it a good 4X meta strategy. After all, on the political level, public awareness and backlash are just factors on the board you have to consider in your quest for conquest. Truth is unimportant. In fact, truth is unflattering, but most importantly, Truth can be subjective. Human beings, by nature, seek a simple and digestible version of reality, when reality is an incredibly complex web of bullshit that just keeps happening. Human beings tend to become attached to their simple lens of reality, and will fight to defend it. One fantastic example of this is that the official story of 9/11 was always questioned by conspiracy nuts and really dummy low IQ people. Some of them would say things like,
I was told by a genetic engineer about a project they were on in England once, and I never told the story on air because it's so fantastical. Oh, God. They had in tanks people with gills, and they're little babies, and they were in there just gulping, clawing at the sides. You see a turtle at the zoo, and it wants out, and you feel for it. They got humanoids crossed with fish and stuff. I mean, we are screwed, people. I mean, do you understand that?
all I know is that a conspiracy nut will look at me, chewing tobacco in his mouth, and say, yup, the moon landing? Fuck you, listen to me, you dumb fucking moron. You really think the government didn't fucking 9/11 itself? I watched a documentary where they put a fucking plane in a hologram. They put a hologram in a plane, and they fuck. Such a sentiment has, for a long time, been rightfully looked down upon. After experiencing the worst attack on citizens in American history, nope, not that one. Nope. Yep, yeah. After experiencing the worst attack on citizens in American history, we were naturally very touchy when the subject of 9/11 came under scrutiny. However, with the hindsight of knowing our hysteria was used to strip away our privacy, and that the reports of nuclear weapons in Iraq used to justify invasion were verifiably untrue, and that the government pointed the finger at uninvolved enemy political figures for its own benefit, could it be possible that maybe, just maybe, that America would have been willing to 9/11 itself after all? Well, I mean, a fucking course. But only because the script says willing to. Stop gasping. Jesus, this is an issue of semantics. Let me explain. Back after Hitler croaked and World War II ended, the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, two large and politically opposed cultural bubbles, dominated a large portion of the world. They were angry and cranky at each other in a passive-aggressive multi-decade feud called the Cold War. Note: please do not take any overly cynical writing style as an indication of political leaning. I happen to believe exactly what you believe. Period. Moving on. During the early Cold War, Cuba was run by an American-backed military dictator named Batista. Under his authoritarian rule, most of the sugar plantations were owned by foreigners like Americans, who exported 70% of Cuban sugar to the United States. This was happy, cool, fun for America because happy sugar, yum yum. However, some Cubans were upset that their government was overtaken by military sergeants who killed tens of thousands of people. This was less sugar, yum yum, so nationalists led revolutionary attacks against Batista's government for a decade until New Year's Eve of 1958, when he bailed out of Cuba and fled with about $700 million in stolen art and treasures. The government was taken over by Marxists, who successfully replaced the capitalist hellscape with a communist hellscape instead. And so Cuba became a red stain on America's map that was a little too close for comfort, and America at the time really didn't like the color red. Cut to JFK's administration, 1962. A totally not a Nazi-looking type of fella by the name of Lyman L. Lemnitzer hands a proposal to then-President JFK for a plan of action in order to regain military control of Cuba from those dirty Reds. This 12-page document was called Operation Northwoods. While originally this was top secret, in the early 2000s it was declassified by the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act, which means that it was originally never meant to see the light of day, a fact that will become very evident as we read through it together. Buckle up, motherfuckers. Alright, top secret special handling, unclassified, memorandum for the Secretary of Defense, subject, justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. 1. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have considered the attached memorandum for the Chief of Operations Cuba project, which responds to a request that the Office for Brief but Precise Description of Pretext, which would provide which responds to a request of that office for brief but precise description of pretext, which would provide justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. 2. The Joint Chiefs of Staff recommend that the proposed memorandum be forwarded as a preliminary submission suitable for planning purposes. It is assumed that there will be similar submissions for other agencies, that these inputs will be used as a basis for developing a time-phased plan. Individual projects can then be considered considered on a case-by-case basis. 3. Further, it is assumed that a single agency will be given the primary responsibility for developing military and paramilitary aspects of the basic plan. It is recommended that this responsibility for both overt and covert military operations be assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The problem. 1. As requested by Chief of Operations Cuba Project, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are to indicate brief but precise description of pretexts which they consider would provide justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Facts bearing to the problem. 2. It is recognized that any action which becomes pretext for U.S. military intervention in Cuba will lead to a political decision which then would lead to military action. 3. This plan, incorporating projects selected from the attached suggestions or from other sources, should be developed to focus all efforts on a specific ultimate objective which would provide adequate justification for U.S. military intervention. Such a plan would enable a logical buildup of incidents to be combined with other seemingly unrelated events to camouflage the ultimate objective and create the necessary impression of Cuban rashness and irresponsibility on a large scale, directed at other countries as well as the United States. The plan would also properly integrate and time phase the course of action to be pursued. The desired resultant from the execution of this plan would be to place the United States in the apparent position of suffering defensible grievances from a rash and irresponsible government of Cuba, and to develop an international image of a Cuban threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere. 4. Time is an important factor in resolution of the Cuban problem. Therefore, the plan should be so time-phased that projects would be operable within the next few months. 5. As much as the ultimate objective is overt military intervention, it is recommended that primary responsibility for developing military and paramilitary aspects of the plan for both overt and covert military operations be assigned the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Jesus fucking Christ.
Note: the courses of action which follow are a preliminary submission suitable only for planning purposes. They are arranged neither chronologically nor in ascending order. Together with similar inputs from other agencies, they are intended to provide a point of departure for the development of a single integrated time-phase plan. Such a plan would permit the evaluation of individual projects within the context of cumulative, correlated actions designed to lead inexorably to the objective of adequate justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Since it would seem desirable to use legitimate provocation as the basis for U.S. military intervention in Cuba, a cover and deception plan, to include requisite preliminary actions, such as has been developed in response to some motherfucking document, could be executed as an initial effort to provoke Cuban reactions. Harassment plus deceptive actions to convince the Cubans of imminent invasion would be emphasized. Our military posture throughout execution of the plan will allow a rapid change from exercise to intervention if Cuban response justifies. A series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. Incidents to establish a credible attack, not in chronological order. 1. Start rumors. Many. I just double-clicked to fucking change the page like a maniac. 1. Start rumors. Many. Use clandestine radio. 2. Land friendly Cubans in uniform over the fence to stage attack on base. 3. Capture Cuban-friendly saboteurs inside the base. 4. Start riots near the base main gate. Friendly Cubans. 5. Blow up ammunition inside the base. Start fires. 6. Burn aircraft on airbase. Sabotage. 7. Lob mortar shells from outside of base into base. Some damage to installations. 8. Capture assault teams approaching from the sea or vicinity of Guantanamo City. 9. Capture militia group which storms the base. 10. Sabotage ships in harbor. Large fires. Naphthalene. 11. Sink ships near harbor entrance. Conduct funerals for mock victims, maybe in lieu of 10. B. United States would respond by executing offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, destroying artillery and mortar emplacements which threaten the base. C. Commence large-scale United States military
military operations. 3. Remember the main incident could be arranged in several forms. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. B. We could blow up a drone unmanned vessel anywhere in Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such incident in the vicinity of Havana or Santiago as a spectacular result of Cuban attack from the air or sea or both. The presence of Cuban planes or ships merely investigating the intent of the vessel could be fairly compelling evidence that the ship was taken under attack. The nearness to Havana or
Santiago would add credibility, especially to those people that might have heard the blast or have seen the fire. The U.S. could follow up with an air or sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized. Exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement would also be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government. 5. A Cuban-based, Castro-supported filibuster could be simulated against... Fuck my dad. I just changed the page again. Against a neighboring Caribbean nation in the vein of the 14th of June invasion of the Dominican Republic. We know that Castro is backing subversive efforts clandestinely against Haiti, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Nicaragua at present, and possibly others. These efforts can be magnified, and additional ones contrived for exposure. For example, advantage can be taken of the sensitivity of the Dominican Air Force to intrusions within their national airspace. Cuban B-26 or C-46 type aircraft could make cane-burning raids at night. Soviet bloc incendiaries could be found. This could be coupled with Cuban messages to the communist underground in the Dominican Republic and Cuban shipments of arms which would be found or intercepted on the beach. 6. Use of MiG-type aircraft by U.S. pilots could provide additional provocation. Harassment of civil air, attacks on surface shipping, and destruction of U.S. military drone aircraft by MiG-type planes would be useful as complementary actions. An F-86 properly painted would convince air passengers that they saw a Cuban MiG, especially if the pilot of the transport were to announce such fact. The primary drawback to this suggestion appears to be the security risk inherent in obtaining or modifying an aircraft. However, reasonable copies of the MiG could be produced from U.S. resources in about 3 months. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft should appear to continue as harassing measures condoned by the government of Cuba. Concurrently, genuine defections of Cuban civil and military air and surface craft should be encouraged. 8. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. The destination would be chosen only to cause the flight plan route to cross Cuba. The passengers could be a group of college students off on a holiday, or any grouping of persons with a common interest to support chartering a non-scheduled flight. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. At a designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. Takeoff times of the drone aircraft and the actual aircraft will be scheduled to allow a rendezvous south of Florida. From the rendezvous point, the passenger-carrying aircraft will descend to minimum altitude and go directly into an auxiliary field at Eglin Air Force Base, where arrangements will have been made to evacuate the passengers and return the aircraft to its original status. The drone aircraft, meanwhile, will continue to fly the filed flight plan. When over Cuba, the drone will begin transmitting on the international distress frequency a Mayday message stating he is under attack by Cuban MiG aircraft. The transmission will be interrupted by destruction of the aircraft, which will be triggered by radio signal. This will allow radio stations in the Western Hemisphere to tell the US what has happened to the aircraft, instead of the US trying to sell the incident. 9. It is possible to create an incident which will make it appear that communist Cuban MiGs have destroyed a US Air Force aircraft over international waters in an unprovoked attack. Approximately 4 or 5 F-101 aircraft will be dispatched in trail from Homestead Air Force Base, Florida to the vicinity of Cuba. Their mission will be to reverse course and simulate Fakir aircraft for an air defense exercise in southern Florida. These aircraft would conduct variations of these flights at frequent intervals. Crews would be briefed to remain at least 12 miles off the Cuban coast. However, they would be required to carry live ammunition in the event that hostile actions were taken by Cuban MiGs. B. On one such flight, a pre-briefed pilot would fly tail-end Charlie at considerable interval between aircraft. While near the Cuban island, this pilot would broadcast that he had been jumped by MiGs and was going down. No other calls would be made. The pilot would then fly directly west at extremely low altitude and land at a secure base at Eglin Auxiliary. The aircraft would be met by the proper people, quickly stored and given a new tail number. The pilot, who had performed the mission under an alias, would resume his proper identity and return to his normal place of business. The pilot and aircraft would have then effectively disappeared. At precisely the same time that the aircraft was presumably shot down, a submarine or small surface craft would disperse F-101 parts, parachute, etc. at approximately 15 to 20 miles off the Cuban coast and depart. The pilots returning to Homestead would have a true story as far as they knew. Search ships and aircraft could be dispatched in parts of aircraft found.
It's scary that there's someone that typed that up. So here's the thing. There's multiple levels of scary on part of that, because there's someone that has the power to type that up.
Yeah.
Then there's a group of people that, after this was created, read this all together. Okay, and then a group of individuals said this is okay. Then this person who is paid by the taxes of the people that he's going to kidnap and kill, i.e. these college students, these individuals can hand this document over to one of the most powerful people on the planet, the American president, and he's not fired after the president reads this document that he just wants to commit wartime criminal acts. So laws for these types of people are suggestions.
Turn on the TV, they hit the Pentagon! They hit the fucking Pentagon!
Wow, the US government is poggers. One thing that might have immediately stood out is the mention of using unmanned drones in 1963. While this might be alarming to a lot of people who consider drone technology to be a recent thing, it really isn't, as drones have been around since at least the 1940s. They've only entered the public consciousness around the early 2000s. Cool. It's generally accepted that black sector technology is decades ahead of the public sector. For instance, UFOs that make up most sightings are actually government vehicles, not extraterrestrial visitors. But what's actually seriously noteworthy is the ridiculous extent that we would have gone to in order to simulate these attacks of such magnitude. Sinking an aircraft carrier, faking the death and funerals of its entire crew, attacking and capturing Cuban infrastructure, capturing actors, dehumanizing Cuban refugees by both sending them to Florida and bombing them, and disappearing a plane full of American college students, all while blaming Cuba, were all enthusiastically laid out in that document as effective measures to draw out American outrage and to, quote, provide pretext and justification for military intervention in Cuba by portraying the Cuban government as irresponsible and a danger to the Western Hemisphere. This was a proposal that JFK rejected. But let's say for a moment that JFK in the 60s really didn't like the whole Cuba problem and signed off on it instead. Having already been signed off by Chief Horse of State, Northwoods would have gone through the cogs and been enacted within the span of months, and we would be living in a very different world. Instead of a declassified document, we'd be reading a Wikipedia article about that day Cuba attacked America out of the blue. Fortifications got bombed, an aircraft carrier would have exploded, with a list of over 100 people who perished. Some college kids would have gotten hijacked, and a civilian would have been shot down in the middle of the ocean by Cubans. Each person with a name and a history. There would be some nuts on the internet saying that the government tossed plane parts in the water, but that would be so blatantly ridiculous, we would have a word to dismiss them by. Luckily, JFK was famously critical of America's drooling maw for Cuba, so he dismissed the proposal and then lived out the rest of his presidency and lived happily ever after. However, while all of this is really super cool, none of it has to do with this video's namesake, 9/11. Sure, this is a verifiably real document, but all this realistically demonstrates is that the American government has, for some time, retained the capability and the means to very quickly enact false flags attacks on itself for the purpose of justifying its aggression in foreign conflicts using completely secret technology. That's all. Besides, there's plenty of evidence that supports the official story of what happened on 9/11. For instance, as the first plane hit the tower, a passport flew out of one of the hijackers' pockets and out of the window, naturally getting a little singed in the explosion. Hi guys, it's the editor here. I think I need to make a public apology. While fact-checking this section, it seems I found an error that needs to be addressed. In this video, I make the claim that the passport is lightly singed. If you were to do an internet search for 9/11 passport, you'd find quite a few of the hijackers' passports, one of which is real toasty. However, the passport that was found a few blocks from the World Trade Center after the first tower was struck belonged to Satam al-Suqami, which we have many pictures of, which depict no damage. Please do not let this encourage ridiculous conspiracy theories, as it's much more likely he cracked the window and threw it out of the plane to send a message. I sincerely apologize for spreading misinformation, and I hope that you can fucking beat me to death. Thank you. As the first plane hit the tower, a passport flew out of one of the hijackers' pockets and out of the window, naturally getting a little singed in the explosion. Due to a stroke of good fortune, some guy wearing a suit managed to pick up this vital piece of evidence that landed on a city block and hand it in to a detective who was on the scene.
Another development on Saturday, New York officials revealed at a news conference here in the city that a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site. You can believe that.
This unidentified hero slipped back into the crowd, presumably getting to safety, before the area was blanketed in multiple layers of passport-obscuring freedom dust. As this vital piece of evidence came right after the second tower was struck, this breaking news contributed towards understanding the culprits of the attacks immediately after it happened. Besides this, Osama bin Laden took responsibility for the attacks on 9/11. Whoops, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. Hold on. Despite staunchly denying responsibility for the attacks, America very quickly knew that Osama bin Laden was our guy. This is largely due to the Pentagon releasing a video they got of Osama bin Laden inexplicably being recorded talking about planning 9/11 and playing soccer. We demanded that Al-Qaeda give up Osama bin Laden for the crime of 9/11ing America, and when Al-Qaeda said, we declared war. War on terror itself. Now, before we continue, it's important to address the elephant in the room. Baseless conspiracy theories. Some uninformed individuals might think that 9/11 could not have been committed by a bunch of hoodlums in caves, and so the US government must have been behind it. However, this assumption is rooted in foolishness and very unbased racism. The fact is, Al-Qaeda was a very well-funded and capable group, thanks in part to Operation Cyclone, an unimaginably expensive CIA program that ran from 1979 to some point after 1989, where the CIA was spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year funding and arming Islamist radical groups around Iraq in order to fight the Soviets. It was a cyclone, all right. A cyclone of cash. Over the span of a little over a decade, this created a situation where radical Islamics in the region would be inexplicably well-armed, well-funded, and well-organized, flying in the face of the cave-dwelling racist stereotypes a lot of Westerners swallowed. Osama bin Laden wasn't chilling by a fire all day. He was a gamer, just like you and me, with a hard drive full of porn and a schizophrenic self-published book by some guy about the 13 bloodlines of the Illuminati. A regular Joe Schmalhayed. Pankin 2, Racists 0. Even though nobody took the blame for 9/11 until confession under literal black site torture, the United States had a strong case against the radical Islamic terror cell that it absolutely did not fund and create. In fact, we had some very close allies who were on the ground during 9/11 specifically to collect evidence against our attackers. During 9/11, on September 11, 2001, a 9/11 lady in Jersey City was watching 9/11 through her window. She saw several individuals cheering, taking funny photos, and Fortniting in front of the backdrop of 9/11, which was very visibly happening from there. on 9/11. Concerned, she called 911 to report this possible 9/11ing. While I'm purposely being fucking ridiculous, what's of particular importance is that they were seen posing and cheering when only the first plane had hit the tower, when the consensus was that the event was a terrible accident. They were soon pulled over and arrested, and their van identified as an Urban Movers vehicle. Jersey City PD put out an APB for all Urban Movers vans. The 5 people detained were all of Israeli nationality, with no work visas, working for a company that would eventually be deemed a Mossad front organization by the FBI, where it was discovered that they were all Israeli agents before being released and taken back home by their embassy. Considering this wild coincidental timing, it's understandable where illiterate rednecks could have gotten the idea that scary Jesus killers done did their pretty towers down. However, it's important to note that correlation does not equal causation. After the initial 5 agents were released, they appeared on an Israeli talk show in order to explain that they were innocently documenting 9/11 happening.
And at that point, we were taken for another round of questioning, this time related to our allegedly being members of Mossad. The fact of the matter is, we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
From their intelligence, they understood that the Twin Towers would be attacked, and they wanted to have our backs by documenting what happened. Israel was looking out for us. Yippee! Now, conspiracy theorists might look at this and say, if you knew, why didn't you stop it? Why'd you get caught high-fiving and flossing over a prized phallic symbol of prosperity smoldering in the distance? Why did news of the $2.1 trillion that went missing from the US budget drop on September 10th, 2001, and never come up again afterward? So that unimaginably large amount of money was never accounted for.
Our financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. We cannot share information from floor to floor in this building because it's stored on dozens of different technological systems that are inaccessible or incompatible.
Okay, that's actually a really good question, and one I can't sarcastically hand-wave away. Also, fun fact, that hemorrhaging gap in the budget has grown since to well over $20 trillion by now. That missing amount of money is about equivalent to the country's debt. Cool. Now, valid criticism has come up against conspiratoids making these claims, citing that Donald Rumsfeld, at the time Secretary of Defense, made very clear distinctions that this was not money that was missing, but money that could not be tracked to its spending. However, that doesn't change the fact that the gaping hole has grown 10 times in the 20 years since, and that the worst wound the US received as a nation came right after the news of this would be dropping to the American people, just like that plane dropped right on the people who were fucking working on that project in the Pentagon. Which means that, purely by happenstance, this event enabled insane levels of ineptitude and lack of oversight for 2 decades. So, 2 things. 1. There is nothing fishy about any of this whatsoever, and anything strange can be blamed on bureaucrats having their thumbs up their asses. Classic bureaucrats. 2. This is dangerous because it can lead to serious conspiracy theorization that cannot be controlled. For example, that governments would conspire to victimize themselves for their own benefit. So, we need to squash out these dangerous and possibly racist narratives immediately. Let's start with the anti-Semitic one, that Israel somehow did this. First of all, Israel is our ally. Do they happen to have a track record of attacking their own ally?
On the 8th of June 1967, during the height of the Six-Day War, the American auxiliary research ship, the USS Liberty, approaches the Sinai coast to facilitate command and control, otherwise known as information warfare, during the Middle Eastern hostilities. Unbeknownst to the Liberty, a series of unfortunate events are to fall together which will result in the death of some 34 crew members and the wounding of a further 164.
With the war reaching its climax, Israeli jets and motor torpedo boats launch an unprovoked attack on the ship. They drop napalm and strafe its decks with rockets, cannon fire, and armor-piercing rounds before trying to sink it with torpedoes.
We had no way to defend ourselves, and we were just slaughtered.
And they shot up the life rafts that were put into the water, and they shot the ones that were still on board the ship.
Back during the Six-Day War, the USS Liberty, while intel gathering, came under heavy fire from unmarked vessels that attacked from both the air and sea. Ultimately, around 30 to 50 people would either die or go missing, as the unmarked ships attacked the crew and specifically targeted its lifeboats. Due to almost all the torpedoes destined for the vessel missing, it managed to stay afloat, despite the private US military radio frequency that they were using being jammed by the attackers. They managed to put out an SOS SOS signal, after which the attack immediately ceased.
Why didn't they sink it?
Well, I think they ran out of ammunition. I know the aircraft ran out of ammunition, so there should have been 6 torpedoes fired. There were 5 that were fired. Only 1 actually struck the ship, but it struck the ship in the vital area where all of our communications personnel, intelligence personnel were working. As a matter of fact, I have a picture right here. This was taken of me the next morning.
President Fucknucket Dick Squab, I literally don't give a fuck, actually called off the rescue operation as to not embarrass his allies, ignoring the broken international laws of both using unmarked vessels and shooting out the lifeboats. The incident was just a real bad fucky-wucky, as if the Liberty had sunk, the unmarked vessels could be blamed on just about anybody, like Please do not acknowledge this CIA document that implicates at-the-time Defense Minister Moshe Dayan in deliberately ordering the attacks, because I'm not here to theorize about dumb conspiracy nonsense. I'm here to make the very clear and unobfuscated point that propaganda is clear and obvious when you see it from the outside. The term hypernormalization has, in recent decades, become relevant as it refers to an age of information where reality becomes indistinguishable from what isn't real. Hyperreality has become very self-evident in the insane barrage of information everyday life presents us, as well as the fact that every ounce of media presented to you, whether it's a picture on Instagram, or an advertisement, or a video, is carefully cut, doctored, and curated for its best presentation and usually with ulterior motive. This is hyperreality, and it encourages us to see the world in an easier lens than it exists. The point is, our reality is a very complicated and unsupposable series of events, and human beings are complicated, elusive creatures who learn to deceive before we learn to walk. Human beings are egotistical creatures who socially project a more cohesive and benign version of themselves to others. And humans, when faced with the constant overwhelming barrage of information from reality, create an internal impression of reality in the form of a belief system, an understanding of the world, and an understanding of themselves that builds up and invariably distorts from the reality it's based on. Then, we start to dismiss reality because we believe our own BS instead. So while there's no grand conclusion, no slam dunk, it's more than fair to leave off on this note: the definition of a fool. Fool. Noun. One who walks into a space without regard for what is to come next. While fool has a negative connotation in our culture, the truth is it really shouldn't, since as a human, by nature you are innately foolish. Considering how the human brain intakes information, one cannot move into a space fully regarding what could possibly be around it. And when this is expanded to include the absolute noise of international geopolitics, we'll find that most of the noise we hold close to our hearts is just that: noise. It's okay to be a fool. You're only human. You can either acknowledge your foolishness and keep it in check, or reject your foolishness and believe you aren't one. With that being said, I'm calling this video here. This has been a really wonderful learning experience, and man, I can keep going. So, to conclude this arbitrary review of 9/11, the whole thing kind of fucking sucked, but it was a great excuse to stick our noses where it didn't belong. However, it probably wasn't some crazy Northwoods-esque plan involving swapping out drone aircraft and shit, unless of course a couple of the plane's flight paths happened to intersect perfectly over a private 9/11. Final score: 4 out of 10. Fuck you. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned stuff. If you liked it, press some fucking buttons. I don't know. Open up the comment bar and smash your face against the keyboard. All of that encourages YouTube to toss my video around like a tasty salad. And if you really liked it, please download and re-upload it if it goes down. Bye bye, take care, and don't forget that everything you know is a lie.
These days it's hard to seize, but opportunities bend. We spend the chance living on the top of the fence. Can't believe what we see, won't be burned to the ground. Though we make ourselves castles every time we